One decision made in
Hold
less
on,
than
soldier.
5 seconds would haunt a
Let me
battlefield
help
for the
you.
next 40 years. A wounded American
You!
soldier
Why
watched
are
the
you still
last
here?
German
This area
uniforms
is
disappear
evacuated. You are
through the
ordered to
trees
leave.
and
Go
knew
now or
no
face
one
the
was coming back
consequences.
for him.
Ready
Then one
when
pair
you
of
are.
footsteps stopped,
Let's get
not because
to
of an
it.
order,
All
not
right,
because
on
of a
three.
treaty, not because anyone was watching.
We have to keep
Someone had
moving.
chosen to stay.
I know.
Why would a
Stay
German
close.
nurse risk
getting closer.
everything for the enemy everyone else
Your
had been
watch,
told to leave
Sergeant.
behind?
Thank you,
And why
nurse.
would that single
Be
act
safe
of
out
mercy
there.
become the
You
one
too.
memory an American veteran could never explain without falling silent? By the time the truth finally surfaced decades later, it no longer mattered who had won the battle. It only mattered who had refused to surrender their humanity. The morning air carried the damp scent of pine and wet earth as a slow mist drifted between shattered trees near the Rhine. The fighting had already rolled west, leaving behind an uneasy silence broken only by distant engines and the occasional cry of frightened birds returning to branches that had survived another night. Medical personnel moved quickly along a narrow forest road, gathering what equipment they could carry before withdrawing towards safer ground. Among them walked Anna Weiss, 28 years old, a military nurse whose calm hands had treated more exhaustion than she cared to remember. She spoke little, conserving her strength the way others rationed food. Every few yards she glanced over her shoulder, not out of fear, but from habit. Nurses learned early that the quietest places often hid the people still breathing. The evacuation order had been unmistakable. Everyone able to move was expected to leave immediately. Vehicles were already disappearing beyond the trees, their engines fading into the distance. Anna adjusted the leather strap of her medical satchel and followed the others until something caught her attention. It was not a voice. It was movement so slight it could have been mistaken for wind shifting fallen branches. She stopped. Ahead, beyond a patch of broken brush, a single hand rested against the damp ground, barely visible beneath a torn field jacket. The sleeve carried no German insignia. She stepped closer, careful and deliberate, her boots sinking softly into rain-soaked soil. The young man lying there could not have been much older than 24. Mud covered most of his uniform, but one faded American shoulder patch remained visible through the dirt. His breathing was shallow, almost impossible to notice unless someone was looking for it. Anna lowered herself beside him without speaking. Behind her, another medic called her name and pointed toward the road. The convoy was leaving. She looked once toward the disappearing column, then back at the stranger whose life now rested between the weight of duty and the quiet voice of her own conscience. Anna did not reach for her map. She did not look toward the road again. Instead, she slipped 2 fingers gently against the young soldier's neck, searching for the quiet rhythm that separated life from memory. It was faint, uneven, but unmistakably there. Relief did not appear on her face. She had learned years earlier that relief could wait until people were safe. Around her, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere beyond the trees an engine started, then another. The convoy was leaving exactly as ordered. Every instinct drilled into military personnel insisted she should stand, shoulder her bag, and keep walking. Instead, she opened her satchel. Inside, every bandage, every bottle, every instrument had been packed before sunrise with careful precision. Now each item carried a different weight. Supplies meant for her own retreat would instead belong to a stranger wearing another nation's uniform. She removed a canteen first. Tilting his head only slightly, she dampened his lips rather than forcing him to drink. Patience often saved more lives than urgency. The soldier stirred almost imperceptibly, his eyelids trembling before settling once again. She noticed how young he looked without the alertness expected of someone in uniform. His face reminded her of boys she had once treated during training exercises before the war had consumed nearly every familiar future. A distant voice echoed through the trees. Someone called her name again, sharper this time. Anna closed her eyes for only a heartbeat. She knew the consequences of remaining behind. A missing nurse would invite questions. A nurse discovered assisting an American could invite far worse. Yet none of those thoughts changed what she saw in front of her. Patients did not become less deserving because flags changed. That belief had survived every lecture, every evacuation, every whispered argument among exhausted medical staff. She loosened the straps of the soldier's field pack to ease his breathing, then carefully examined his shoulder and sighed with movements practiced so many times they required almost no thought. There was no panic in her hands, only quiet efficiency. She tore clean cloth into narrower strips, securing fresh dressings while listening to the forest as carefully as she listened to his breathing. After several minutes, his eyes opened just enough to catch a blur of gray fabric and a Red Cross armband. Confusion clouded his expression. He tried to move, but managed only the slightest shift before exhaustion claimed the effort. Anna placed one hand gently against his shoulder. "Do not waste your strength," she said softly in careful English. "You are safe for now." The words sounded almost impossible even to her, yet the young soldier stopped struggling. His breathing steadied a little. Above them, pale sunlight finally slipped through the branches, painting thin ribbons of gold across the damp ground, while somewhere beyond the forest the last truck disappeared from sight, taking with it Anna's easiest chance to leave. For several long moments neither of them spoke. The forest did not ask who was German or who was American. It simply stood around them, damp with morning rain and scented with pine, as if waiting to see what choice would come next. Daniel Carter opened his eyes again, this time long enough to focus on the woman beside him. His breathing remained shallow, but his mind had begun to clear. He saw the gray uniform first, then the medical satchel, then the calm face studying him without anger or fear. His expression tightened with uncertainty. Everything he had been told insisted he should not trust what he was seeing. Anna understood that look without needing a translator. She had seen it in frightened civilians, in exhausted soldiers, and in children separated from their families. Fear often looked exactly the same, regardless of language. She slowly removed a small piece of bread from her satchel and broke it into two uneven pieces. She placed the larger one into Daniel's hand before taking the smaller piece for herself. Then she quietly ate first. No explanation, no persuasion. Only a simple gesture meant to answer the question he had not yet asked. Daniel watched her for several seconds before cautiously taking a bite. The bread was dry and plain, but it carried something he had not expected to receive from the other side of the war. Trust never arrived all at once. It arrived one quiet decision after another. The morning slowly brightened. Birds returned to the branches overhead, their songs sounding strangely ordinary after so many days filled with engines and shouted commands. Anna looked toward the narrow trail leading west. The safest route would no longer be the fastest one. Patrols from either army could appear without warning, and neither side would easily understand why a German nurse and an American infantryman were traveling together. She folded a blanket from her medical kit and wrapped it around Daniel's shoulders before checking the leather strap of his field pack. It was too heavy for him to carry in his condition. Without hesitation, she lifted it onto her own shoulder beside her medical bag. The combined weight pulled against her back immediately, but she did not complain. Daniel noticed the effort and quietly shook his head. "Leave it," he whispered. Anna looked at him with steady blue eyes. "If I leave this," she answered softly, "then I leave part of you." The words surprised even her because they had come without thought. She was not speaking about equipment. She was speaking about dignity. Together they rose slowly, one careful step at a time. Daniel leaned against a sturdy walking stick Anna had cut from a fallen branch, while she remained close enough to steady him without making him feel helpless. Their pace was painfully slow, only a few yards every minute, but each step carried them farther from the battlefield and closer to a future neither of them could yet imagine. Behind them the forest swallowed every footprint beneath damp leaves, as though quietly protecting the secret it had just witnessed. They followed no road because roads belong to armies. Instead, Anna guided Daniel through narrow deer trails that twisted beneath towering pines and over damp hillsides where fallen leaves softened every footstep. The farther they walked, the quieter the world became. The distant rumble of military vehicles faded until it sounded less like war and more like approaching thunder somewhere beyond the horizon. Every 100 yards or so Anna stopped, not because she wished to rest, but because she listened. A nurse learned that silence carried information. Flowing water meant fresh streams. Crows gathering in one place often meant recent human movement. The sudden absence of birds usually meant someone else was nearby. Daniel watched her with growing curiosity. She moved through the forest with confidence that reminded him of experienced farmers back home reading the weather without ever looking at the sky. "How do you know where to go?" he asked quietly after they crossed a shallow creek no more than ankle deep. Anna smiled faintly without slowing her pace. I do not, she admitted. I only know where we should not go. It sounded like a simple answer, yet Daniel understood there was wisdom inside it. By early afternoon, the clouds began to break apart. Thin ribbons of sunlight filtered through fresh spring leaves, warming patches of moss that glowed almost emerald green. They reached an abandoned hunting cabin tucked against a hillside, its weathered wooden walls leaning slightly with age. The roof still held. One window remained intact. It was enough. Anna eased Daniel onto a rough wooden bench before collecting rainwater that had gathered inside an old barrel beside the porch. She rinsed her hands carefully before preparing fresh dressings. Every movement remained calm, measured, almost ceremonial. Daniel noticed that she never hurried, even when time seemed precious. "You never look afraid," he said. Anna wrapped a clean bandage with practiced care before answering. "Fear is useful," she replied. "It reminds us to pay attention. Panic only makes us stop thinking." Daniel nodded slowly. He had heard officers deliver speeches about courage before battles, yet none of them had explained it as clearly as this quiet nurse changing bandages inside an empty cabin. As evening settled across the forest, the temperature dropped noticeably. Anna found several pieces of dry wood stored beneath the porch roof and built the smallest fire she could manage, just enough to warm the room without sending thick smoke above the trees. The gentle crackling filled the silence between them. Daniel reached into his pocket and carefully removed a small folded photograph protected inside a worn leather wallet. It showed an older couple standing beside a white farmhouse with a red barn behind them. Anna studied the picture for only a second before handing it back with both hands. "Your family?" she asked. Daniel smiled for the first time since she had found him. "Kansas," he said softly. "They still think I will walk through that front door someday." Anna looked into the quiet fire, her eyes reflecting its faint golden light. "Then we should keep moving tomorrow," she answered. Someone should not spend another season waiting. Morning arrived without ceremony. Pale light slipped through the cabin window and settled across the wooden floor, revealing tiny particles of dust floating through the still air. Outside, the forest had awakened long before either of them. Birds called from the treetops, and somewhere beyond the ridge a stream carried fresh snow melt over smooth stones. For the first time in days, Daniel realized he had slept without expecting to hear shouted commands. Anna was already awake. She sat near the fading embers, quietly repairing the torn strap on her medical satchel with a needle and heavy thread. Every movement was patient, almost effortless, as though careful work itself was a form of peace. Daniel watched for a moment before speaking. "Why did you become a nurse?" Anna tied a small knot before looking up. "My father repaired watches," she said. "He believed that if something could be restored, you should never throw it away." She smiled gently at the memory. "I only chose a different way to repair things." Daniel considered her answer in silence. It sounded simple, yet it explained everything she had done since finding him. After sharing the last of their bread and a few careful sips of water, they continued west, moving beneath a canopy of fresh spring leaves that shimmered softly in the morning breeze. Daniel's steps had grown steadier, though each mile still demanded determination. Several times he instinctively reached for his shoulder pack before remembering Anna was carrying it. "You do not have to keep doing that," he said. "It is heavier than it looks." Anna glanced back with the faintest smile. "So are promises," she replied. The words lingered with him long after they continued walking. By midday they reached the crest of a low hill overlooking a broad valley scattered with quiet farms and winding fences. Thin columns of smoke rose from distant chimneys where ordinary families were beginning another day despite everything the world had endured. Daniel stared across the peaceful landscape. "It almost looks untouched," he whispered. Anna followed his gaze. "Nature is patient," she answered. "People eventually remember how to be the same." They rested beneath a large oak tree whose branches stretched wide enough to cast generous shade across the hillside. Daniel removed the worn photograph from his wallet once more. This time he pointed toward the weathered barn in the picture. "Every Sunday my mother insisted we eat together after church," he said with a quiet laugh. "No matter how busy planting season became." Anna listened with genuine interest. "My mother planted roses beside every window," she replied. "She said every house should have one reason to smile before anyone opened the door." For a few peaceful minutes, they were no longer an American soldier and a German nurse. They were simply two children remembering homes that still existed somewhere beyond the horizon. Then Anna noticed something that immediately changed her expression. Fresh wagon tracks crossed the muddy path ahead, accompanied by several recent boot prints leading toward the valley. She slowly lowered herself behind the crest of the hill and motioned for Daniel to do the same. The forest had been protecting them until now. Ahead, the open countryside would demand far greater care. Anna waited without moving until the distant sound of wagon wheels faded into the valley. Only then did she rise carefully from behind the hill. She studied the scattered farmhouses below, the split rail fences, the narrow dirt lanes, and the small orchards beginning to bloom with pale white flowers. It looked peaceful, but she knew appearances could not be trusted. A quiet road could become dangerous simply because the wrong person asked the wrong question. Daniel followed her eyes across the landscape. "Can we make it through there?" he asked softly. Anna did not answer immediately. She measured the distance instead. Nearly a mile of open fields separated them from another stretch of woodland that curved toward the west. "We can," she finally said. "But we must become forgettable." Daniel frowned. "Forgettable?" She nodded. "People remember soldiers. They rarely remember tired travelers who keep walking." She reached into her satchel and removed a plain brown work jacket that had been folded beneath her medical supplies. It had belonged to an elderly farmer she had once treated months earlier, who had insisted she keep it in case someone someday needed it more than he did. She handed it to Daniel. "Cover your uniform." He slipped it on, surprised that despite its rough fabric it fit well enough to hide the patches on his sleeves. Anna then folded her own medical armband and tucked it deep inside her bag. For the first time since Daniel had met her, she no longer looked like military personnel. She looked like an ordinary woman carrying supplies beside a weary traveler. Together they descended into the valley at an unhurried pace. They did not whisper. They did not rush. They simply walked. An older man repairing a wooden fence looked up briefly, offered a polite nod, then returned to his work without another glance. A young girl filling a bucket from a hand pump smiled shyly before hurrying back toward her family's house. Life continued with remarkable determination, refusing to surrender every ordinary moment to the weight of war. Around midday, they stopped beneath a large maple tree beside a narrow stream. Anna filled both canteens while Daniel washed the dust from his hands. Neither spoke for several minutes. The silence no longer felt uncertain. It had become comfortable. Daniel finally looked toward Anna. "Back home, I thought courage always looked loud," he admitted, "like speeches or medals." Anna fastened the cap onto the canteen before handing it back. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "the bravest thing a person does is so ordinary that almost nobody notices." Daniel looked across the slow-moving water, letting her words settle. He realized that if he survived to return home, people would probably ask about battles, victories, and famous commanders. Very few would ask about the woman who chose compassion when nobody was there to reward it. Yet somehow, he already knew that would be the story he would remember for the rest of his life. As the afternoon sun drifted lower, Anna pointed toward a distant line of trees on the western horizon. Beyond those woods, she believed, friendly American positions could not be far away. Neither of them said it aloud, but they both understood the closer they came to safety, the closer they came to saying goodbye. By late afternoon, the line of trees gave way to open ground once again. Anna slowed her pace and raised one hand, asking Daniel to stop. Beyond a gentle rise, carried by the breeze rather than clearly seen, came the faint rhythm of voices speaking English. They were still too far away to recognize individual words, but Daniel knew the sound immediately. His shoulders relaxed for the first time since awakening in the forest. Home was still an ocean away, yet hearing his own language felt like stepping into familiar light. Anna remained still, studying the landscape with the same careful patience that had guided every decision since they met. A narrow meadow stretched between them and the distant tree line where the voices drifted. There was nowhere to hide once they crossed it. Daniel looked at her and understood what she had already decided. "You are not coming any farther," he said quietly. It was not a question. Anna lowered her eyes for a moment before offering a gentle nod. "This is close enough," she answered. "From here, you know your own people better than I do." Neither of them moved. The silence between them carried more meaning than either could easily express. Daniel reached into the pocket of the borrowed work jacket and carefully removed the folded photograph of his parents. He looked at it briefly before placing it back into his wallet. Then he turned toward Anna. "If you had walked away that morning," he said, "my family would never have known what happened." Anna answered with the smallest smile. Then perhaps today was worth the extra miles. She removed the worn work jacket from his shoulders and folded it neatly before placing it back inside her satchel. Next, she handed him his field pack, brushing a trace of dust from the leather strap as though returning something entrusted to her care. Daniel accepted it with both hands. Somehow the pack felt lighter than it had days before, even though nothing inside had changed. Finally, Anna reached into another pocket and produced a small silver pocket watch with a cracked leather cord attached to it. "You dropped this near the stream on the first day," she said. "I thought you might want it back." Daniel stared at the watch in surprise. It had belonged to his father, who had carried it for years before placing it into his son's hand on the day he left Kansas. He had never realized it was missing. His voice nearly failed him. "Thank you," he whispered. Anna simply nodded, as though returning another person's treasured possession required no gratitude at all. The distant English voices grew louder. Daniel knew he only needed to walk another few hundred yards before someone would see him. He looked toward the open meadow, then back at the quiet woman who had carried far more than his supplies through the past several days. "Will I ever see you again?" he asked. Anna looked toward the setting sun, washing the fields in warm gold before answering with complete honesty. "I do not know," she said softly. But that was never the reason to help someone. With that, she stepped back toward the shelter of the trees, leaving Daniel standing alone between two worlds, strong enough at last to finish the final stretch on his own. Daniel stood motionless until the sound of Anna's footsteps disappeared into the forest. He wanted to call after her, but no words seemed large enough to carry everything he felt. Instead, he slipped the silver pocket watch into his jacket, tightened the strap of his field pack, and turned toward the distant voices. Every step across the meadow felt strangely heavier than the miles they had already traveled together. The open field offered nowhere to hide, yet for the first time he no longer feared what lay ahead. As he reached the far side of the meadow, several American soldiers emerged from behind a hedgerow. Their expressions shifted instantly from caution to disbelief. One of them hurried forward, recognizing the faded insignia beneath the borrowed jacket. Another offered Daniel a canteen before asking where he had come from. Daniel looked back over his shoulder. The forest stood quiet beneath the evening sky, its trees swaying gently in the breeze as though nothing extraordinary had happened there at all. "Someone helped me," he answered after a long pause. Someone who had every reason not to. The men exchanged puzzled glances, expecting a longer explanation, but Daniel had nothing more to add. Some stories could not be told in a single sentence. They guided him toward a waiting medical vehicle where doctors examined his injuries with practiced efficiency. They asked about his unit, the route he had taken, and how he had survived alone for so many days. Daniel answered every question honestly except one. Whenever someone asked exactly who had saved him, he simply replied, "A nurse." He never mentioned her name, not because he had forgotten it, but because he understood that names carried consequences in a world still trying to sort friends from enemies. Protecting her identity became the final promise he kept without ever speaking it aloud. Several weeks later, after recovering enough strength to travel, Daniel finally boarded a ship bound for the United States. As the coastline slowly disappeared behind gray morning mist, he removed the pocket watch once again. Tucked inside the back cover, unnoticed until that moment, rested a tiny pressed white flower. He recognized it immediately. It matched the blossoms that had covered the orchard they passed on their journey through the valley. Anna must have placed it there while returning the watch, saying goodbye without using words. Daniel carefully closed the cover and held it in his palm for a long moment. Years passed. Seasons changed. The war became history, then memory. Daniel returned to the Kansas farm where his parents welcomed him home exactly as they had always imagined. Life slowly found its ordinary rhythm again, yet one habit never changed. Every spring, when the first white blossoms appeared on the apple trees behind the farmhouse, Daniel would take out the old silver watch, open its cover, and quietly look at the fragile flowers still resting inside. His children eventually asked why he smiled every time the trees bloomed. Daniel would simply answer that sometimes the most important person in your life is someone you only walk beside for a few days, yet their kindness continues traveling with you long after the road has ended. 40 years passed more quietly than Daniel Carter had ever imagined. The seasons continued their faithful rhythm across the Kansas farm. The old red barn weathered another generation of storms. His parents eventually grew old, and children who had once listened wide-eyed to his bedtime stories became parents themselves. Yet one story always remained unfinished. Whenever neighbors asked about the hardest day of the war, Daniel rarely spoke about marches, battles, or military victories. Instead, his hand would unconsciously reach into the pocket where the silver watch still rested. Inside, the tiny white blossom had faded with time, but it had never fallen apart. One spring, an invitation arrived requesting that Daniel speak at a gathering honoring military medics and nurses. He accepted without hesitation. The auditorium was filled with young nursing students, veterans, and families who believed they had come to hear another account of wartime survival. Daniel walked slowly to the podium, carrying nothing except the old pocket watch. For a long moment, he simply looked across the audience before opening the watch and carefully showing the pressed flower resting inside. "This," he began softly, "is the reason I am standing here." The room became completely still. He spoke about exhaustion, uncertainty, and the quiet courage that rarely appeared in history books. He described a woman who never asked for recognition, never expected gratitude, and never paused to calculate whether compassion was convenient. He never spoke her full name. He never identified the village or the path through the forest. Some promises deserved to outlive the people who made them. Finally, one young nursing student raised her hand and asked the question everyone had been quietly carrying. Was she a hero? Daniel smiled gently before closing the watch. "She would have said she was only doing her job," he answered. "But I learned something important because of her. A uniform can tell you where someone comes from. It cannot tell you who they are." No one applauded immediately. The silence itself became a form of respect. Several years later, during a private trip through Germany, Daniel visited a small country hospital that had served local families for decades. In the entrance hall hung a simple black and white photograph of retired staff members. There, near the center of the frame, stood Anna Weiss wearing the same calm expression he remembered beneath the forest trees. Beneath her photograph were only a few words. "Head nurse. 38 years of service." Daniel stood there for a long time before quietly placing a single white flower beneath the frame. He did not ask whether anyone remembered the story. He did not introduce himself. He simply adjusted the flower, touched the silver watch in his pocket, and walked back into the afternoon sunlight. Some people change history through power. Others change a single life through quiet kindness. Yet sometimes that single life carries their example farther than any army ever could. She never raised her voice. She simply raised the standard of what it meant to remain human.